Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes.
In our city, there's an actual war criminal. And police, all these police officers, guess what? They're not here for that war criminal. They're here for us, for peacefully protesting and demanding that an end to a genocide that's being funded with our money. But they won't do that. Instead, they're protecting Netanyahu, and they're arresting us. And now there's more police officers than there are protesters. And they're terrorizing us just like the IDF and Israel terrorizes people in Gaza and Palestine. I mean, and they learn from the IDF. All of this is in their training. You can't reform this.
And how many times were you pepper sprayed today?
They pepper sprayed us twice, at least me. I don't know, there's people that have been pepper sprayed more. They were just using it, like, they didn't do that on January 6th when people try to take over the Capitol. But they're doing it when we don't want war, and we don't want a genocide that's being funded with our money.
Greetings and blessings, and welcome back to another episode of Curious Naked Diatribes. In this episode, I wanted to respond to Satanyahu's visit to the U.S. to address Congress. I couldn't not respond to this in some way. I felt it deserved an entire episode. To me, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Butcher Bibi, a war criminal, a genocidal maniac, is pure evil personified. And his visit to the United States and address to Congress is an assault on all reason and humanity. But as foul and depraved as he may be, I want to emphasize that simply getting rid of him and maybe a few of his closest henchmen is not enough. It may be cause for celebration to see him rotting behind bars in a rat-infested prison for the rest of his miserable life for all the bloodshed and destruction he's orchestrated over the course of his career. But know this, getting rid of him is simply not enough. We need to understand that much like Donald Trump and other like vermin in politics, he is a symptom, not the disease. And nowhere was that made more evident than in U.S. Congress on July 24th, 2024. As Netanyahu stood before Congress and spewed lie after lie after lie, he received much applause and multiple standing ovations, not just from members of Congress, but even from special guest fascist Elon Musk. Just remember that next time you're in the market for a new car. You can add Tesla Motors to the boycott list. Yes, the government of the United States is infested, and has been for quite some time now, with the hateful ideology of Zionism and the seemingly endless flow of lobby cash to influence the outcome of U.S. elections. But before I get into the filth of Netanyahu's speech, I'd like to take a minute and talk about the resistance and the growing protest movement here in the U.S. And I'm going to conclude with a few comments on Rashida Tlaib's lone dissenting presence. It's almost impossible to speak about peace activism in the U.S. without speaking about Code Pink and co-founder Medea Benjamin in particular.
So we're here in Congress the day after Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu was speaking before Congress and gave this horrible speech, but so many members of Congress gave him a standing ovation again and again and again, particularly the Republicans. There are a couple of things that I wanted to point out. Lies. For example, he said that it is preposterous, it's just fabrication, these accusations that Israel is keeping humanitarian aid from people in Gaza. Of course, we know the truth. We see it in the lines of hundreds and hundreds of trucks that can't get in through the Rafah gate because Israel has closed it. We also heard Netanyahu say that Israeli military is so careful about trying not to kill civilians. And then you see the death toll of 15,000 children killed. Of course, we see that Israel is indiscriminately bombing people in Gaza, and the majority of people being killed are women and children.
And if you follow her on social media, you can see for yourself just what a force she is to be reckoned with. tirelessly challenging members of Congress, so many of whom are deep in the pockets of the Israel lobby, and not backing down from risks to her personal safety, including the risk of arrest. So my hat is off to Medea Benjamin, who continues to inspire. And if you're feeling hopeless and desperate about what's going on in the world right now, just follow her on social media, follow Code Pink, and I guarantee you'll feel differently about activism. And speaking of activism, let's talk about the massive protests upon the arrival of war criminal Netanyahu in Washington. It's hard to pin down an exact number of anti-Israel protesters who showed up in Washington ahead of the speech, but most media outlets say they numbered in the thousands. Thousands of activists, all united in sending a clear message to Netanyahu that a war criminal and an architect of genocide is not welcome. Adding to the momentum of the waves of demonstrators was the ruling from the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, on July 19, that formalized what Palestinians have been saying from the very beginning, which was not October 7th, which is that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal, it represents apartheid, and it must end. Thousands of protesters in the streets of D.C. calling for the arrest of a man who has overseen the deaths of nearly 40,000 Palestinian men, women, and children since October 7th alone. And thousands more will die indirectly as famine and disease spread throughout Gaza. Anyone capable of this much death and destruction needs to be condemned in the strongest possible manner, not rewarded with standing ovations from Congress. As human beings in this world, we need to respond. Demonstrators gathered outside the Watergate Hotel where Netanyahu was booked, making as much noise as possible with drumming, chants, and sirens. An Instagram post from the Palestinian Youth Movement shows that some were even able to gain access to the hotel to release maggots, mealworms, and crickets on a banquet table, and pull fire alarms, creating chaos for the war criminal and his Mossad and Secret Service goons. This is quite impressive, considering the heightened security all over the nation's capital. Tours were canceled, outside police forces were called in, including the NYPD, a metal fence was erected all around the Capitol building, no small expense, and all of it to protect a war criminal who has the balls to stand before Congress and lie. So let's break down those lies, shall we? Let's get into the actual speech, if you can stomach this. I'm going to try. Let's start with one of the most grotesque distortions of reality uttered that day, having to do with casualties.
Remember what so many people said? If Israel goes into Rafah, there'll be thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of civilians killed. Well, last week, I went into Rafah. I visited our troops as they finished fighting Hamas's remaining terrorist battalions. I asked the commander there, how many terrorists did you take out in Rafah? He gave me an exact number, 1,203. I asked him, how many civilians were killed? He said, Prime Minister, practically none, with the exception of a single incident where shrapnel from a bomb hit a Hamas weapons depot and unintentionally killed 24 people. The answer is practically none. You want to know why? Because Israel got the civilians out of harm's way, something people said we could never do, but we did it.
Well, gee, if my commanders told me practically no civilians were killed, I guess it must be true. Bullshit, and he knows it. At least 45 were killed, including children, in one rocket attack on refugee tents alone. He knows that's complete bullshit, and he knows that in this war, there is no distinction between Hamas fighters and 3-year-old children. In their eyes, they're all terrorists. So that number, 1,203, you can bet were mostly, if not all, civilians. But Netanyahu also knows that the U.S. Congress will eat it up if he calls them terrorists. That's literally all he has to do in order to continue murdering children. Fucking shameful. And just another quick note on casualties before moving on. You may remember back in June, the House passed an amendment that would block the Defense Department from using statistics on casualties from the Gaza Health Ministry, as though these numbers are just invented out of thin air. 62 Democrats voted in favor of this. Lie number 2, the aid entering Gaza. Let's listen.
Israel has enabled more than 40,000 aid trucks to enter Gaza. That's 500,000 tons of food. And that's more than 3,000 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. If there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, it's because Hamas is stealing it.
You got that? Hamas is stealing the aid. Do you believe that shit? I certainly don't. According to a report from Al Jazeera, the current level of aid trucks entering Gaza has been reduced to 1/5 the pre-October 7 level. I've personally seen dozens of videos on social media showing aid trucks at a complete standstill, waiting to enter while precious food is left to spoil and rot. And let's not forget about the situation long before October 7, when Israeli officials, who control every crumb that goes into Gaza, were proud to claim they were putting Palestinians on a diet, calculating every calorie so as to keep Gazans just above starvation levels. Israelis have attacked aid trucks, and according to many reports, they've even gone so far as to use an aid truck as cover to infiltrate Gaza's Nusrat camp before proceeding to massacre around 274 Palestinians. These are sick people, absolutely sick. This next one is quite amusing, and I think it shows how the thousands of protesters gathered around the Capitol that day, calling for his immediate arrest, were actually getting to him. So what does he do? He lashed out with this.
We recently learned from the National Security Director, U.S. Director of National Intelligence, that Iran is funding and promoting anti-Israel protests in America. They want to disrupt America. For all we know, Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
He accuses Iran of funding the protesters, and yet he provides not a single scrap of evidence. Nor does National Intelligence Director Avril Haines, who he cites in her press release. I have that right here. She says, "In recent weeks, Iranian government actors have sought to opportunistically take advantage of ongoing protests regarding the war in Gaza, using a playbook we've seen other actors use over the years. We have observed actors tied to Iran's government posing as activists online, seeking to encourage protests and even providing financial support to protesters. The evidence for that? We don't know. She's the National Intel Director, and you're not, so it must be true." She continues, "I want to be clear that I know Americans who participate in protests are, in good faith, expressing their views on the conflict in Gaza. This intelligence does not indicate otherwise. Moreover, the freedom to express diverse views, when done peacefully, is essential to our democracy. But it is also important to warn of foreign actors who seek to exploit our debate for their own purposes." Wow. Did you catch that? For a minute, I thought she was talking about Israel and AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. But members of Congress who actually attended this speech really loved this one. Why? Because these AIPAC warmongers would love nothing more than a war with Iran. War with Iran is their wet dream, and so anything they can do to provoke a war is more than welcome. But he knows he can still count on the good old US of A that never met a war it didn't love. So yeah, I gotta remember to write that thank you letter to Iran for funding this podcast. That check should be in the mail any day now. Absolutely ridiculous. Moving on to the next lie, the one about targeting civilians. This one is yet another example of Israel blaming Hamas for its own crimes. Here's what he said.
The ICC prosecutor accuses Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. What in God's green earth is he talking about? The IDF has dropped millions of flyers, sent millions of text messages, made hundreds of thousands of phone calls to get Palestinian civilians out of harm's way. But at the same time, Hamas does everything in its power to put Palestinian civilians in harm's way. They fire rockets from schools, from hospitals, from mosques.
I mean, this is just such a bald-faced lie. Israel has repeatedly attacked so-called safe zones or humanitarian zones. The pattern is clear to anyone who's been following events in Gaza. Israel issues an evacuation order. The people grab what they can of their belongings and any surviving family members, only to be massacred in the new so-called safe zone. And according to Al Jazeera's reporting, nearly half of the bombs that the Israeli military drops on Gaza are unguided dumb bombs, used to cause as much destruction as possible, not for precision targeting in order to minimize casualties as they claim. And of course, they blame all of their bloodlust on Hamas. And not only does Israel deliberately target civilians, they target doctors, they target journalists. An investigation by the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, found that at least 111 journalists and media workers have been killed since October 7th. Israel doesn't want you to know what's going on. They want to keep you in the dark so they can continue their murder spree. I'll just wrap up this bullshit fest with his lie about ceasefire negotiations. This is what he said.
The war in Gaza could end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders, disarms, and returns all the hostages. But if they don't, Israel will fight until we destroy Hamas's military capabilities, end its rule in Gaza, and bring all our hostages home.
Completely false. Netanyahu insists on the total destruction of Hamas, basically an impossible goal. He's also quite happy to keep the bombs dropping because he knows that the minute they stop, it's curtains for him and his reign of terror. His political career and his far-right coalition are over. And this is not about hostages either. Israel has demonstrated over the years that it cares nothing about the hostages, as it has put into effect, officially or unofficially, the Hannibal Directive, a policy that calls for maximum force in order to prevent a soldier from being taken. I'll conclude here with a few comments on Rashida Tlaib's in-person protest of Netanyahu's address. Rashida Tlaib is the first Palestinian-American woman to serve in Congress and the first of 2 Muslim women elected to Congress. So her presence at the session held a very real significance, and I think a powerful impact. About half of her fellow Democrats, including other members of the squad, chose not to attend the speech. But Tlaib had come wearing a keffiyeh and a special message for Netanyahu, a double-sided sign that she held up during the address. Printed on one side were the words war criminal, and then on the other, guilty of genocide. Photos of this solitary act of resistance, a single voice of dissent amid a room full of fawning enablers of genocide, quickly made their way around social media, inspiring artist renditions and clever memes. At first I found myself asking, where are the other progressive Democrats? Why aren't they there with their signs and their keffiyehs? Then I remembered the heightened security and House Speaker Mike Johnson's warning to Congress members that should guests in the gallery dare to disrupt the speech, they would be arrested, and any congressperson considered disruptive would have to deal with the sergeant at arms. Netanyahu's hateful message that day would be backed with the full support of the law. This past Wednesday, I believe, marked a new low and perhaps one of the most shameful moments in American history. Yes, I'll go that far. The fact that a wanted war criminal would be invited to address Congress is just so beyond repulsive. It's really kind of pathetic how this war criminal, child murderer, can do nothing else but pander to his dwindling support network. Even the UK has shifted and said it will arrest him if he ever sets foot on their soil. My friends, this last week was a lot of pain, but let's remember that the resistance is growing, and nobody needs to face this alone. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can follow me on TikTok and other social media. You can find my articles on Substack and other work on javimedia.net. Que todo sea amor, walk tall, Palestine will be free. Que viva la resistencia, long live the resistance. Javi Media.